Hello, Chris.
Hey, good afternoon.
Thanks for your time. So, has naming and identifying the birds that you photograph led you to notice more about them and how they change and behave?
Yes, certainly. I grew up loving animals of all kinds, Australia's mammals, marsupials, and then getting interested in insects and reptiles and all that sort of thing. And I used to think I really knew birds. Most people will know your galahs and your cockatoos and your kookaburras and things. But a few years back, I started to sort of really make note of what I was seeing, and that led me on a bit of a journey of discovering just exactly how many different bird species we have in Australia, how diverse they are, and how to tell the difference between them. So, yes, certainly, the more you try and pick out what exactly did I just see, the more you see.
So, how did you? I'm interested to find out what exactly about the bird behavior that you find intriguing. I mean, if you sit back and just watch any creature in its natural environment, you can observe a great amount of information and understand, its motivations. It could be looking for food. It could be looking for some shelter. What about bird behavior just gets you so excited?
Um, that's also an interesting question because, in some ways, I always thought birds are, they just fly around, they're not that interesting. But, like you say, the more you look, the more you learn, and the more you realize that they're incredibly diverse and complex in their behaviors. I think birds are probably the most accessible form of wildlife for most people who are living in urban areas, for example. They're throughout our cities. So yeah, each bird is different, and I think yeah, each species also has its own kind of personalities. Some are really cryptic and shy, and it just takes forever to try and get your eyes on one of those. Other birds, for example, there are migratory shorebirds that sort of live on our beaches and lakes on the shores, but they will fly to the northern hemisphere each year, which is where they breed, and then they'll come back down here. And it just astounds me that this little bird sort of fits in the palm of your hand, and somehow it manages to fly 7,000 kilometers each way twice a year, or 14,000 kilometers for some of the larger birds.
I read.
So,
Sorry.
yes, some incredible things that these birds do.
I read the other day the albatross in its lifespan will fly the equivalent of the distance from the Earth to the Moon 8 times. Isn't that astonishing?
That wouldn't surprise me, and they live for decades. Yeah, so they're amazing creatures.
You took an incredible photo of the regent honeyeater in the Wollongong Botanical Gardens. Was that a rare sighting? Tell me about that bird.
Yes, so regent honeyeaters are an Australian bird. They're kind of black with this speckled gold pattern across them. But their numbers have really plummeted in recent decades. I hear stories from birders who've been doing this for decades saying, they've seen hundreds at a time when a eucalyptus tree is blooming and in flower and these birds are feeding. And now you'd be very, very lucky to see a single bird in an entire year of searching for it. That's how infrequent they are. But yeah, I think it was about 3, 4 years ago, one turned up at Wollongong Botanic Gardens, and I think a few years before that, one turned up in Nowra. So when these kind of rare birds turn up and it goes around the birding community, you do get people who will travel just to see these kind of birds.
But the bird can obviously fly away. So, I mean, if you send a message to someone that says, and telling them a regent honeyeater is in the area, are they worried maybe by the time they get there it'll be gone?
Probably depends how passionate they are and how desperate they are. Something they haven't seen before. Some people will sit back and wait and see if there's a second report or a third report, and then they'll travel. But yeah, in the case of the regent honeyeater, in all the cases I'm aware of, there's always been a tree that's been in bloom. So while that tree's in bloom, the bird
Ah,
hangs around the area and then comes out every day and feeds.
okay.
And so all your bird watchers will stand around that tree.
You mentioned shorebirds a moment ago. How far do these birds travel to get here?
Yes, so as I understand it, the bar-tailed godwit travels for something like 14,000 kilometres in one stint, sort of from up towards the Arctic regions, around Alaska, Canada, and around the top there, all the way down to, for example, New Zealand. So that I think holds the record for the longest migration, but a lot of shorebirds travel from the northern hemisphere to the south. So conservation of these birds is complex because like we can do our part here in Australia and say, okay, here's a wetland that they're clearly using. Let's take steps to preserve that and look after it. But you really need every country along the flyway of these species to be doing their part because some of them do travel over land and then they'll rest as they do their migrations. So they need habitat for the entire distance.
So, okay, you've touched on a great point there. Are there migratory patterns being disturbed by changes to the environment?
Yeah, I believe so. I think the numbers of shorebirds have declined like drastically, well over 50% in a lot of species actually. And I think a lot of it gets attributed to habitat being destroyed, basically. A lot of these birds like swampy areas and shallow waters, and they will feed, in muddy areas. And a lot of countries, they need space for housing or for development, and they will just drain the swamp as it is and concrete it and start developing estates and so on. So yeah, habitat loss I think is probably the primary threat facing shorebirds and indeed a lot of other birds as well.
I heard somewhere, and I'd love to know if you heard this as well, or if you think it's a wives' tale, an old myth. Vikings used to carry ravens with them when they were travelling long distances over water. They would throw up the raven, and if it could see land, it would shoot off and land. But if it saw no land, it would come back down to the boat. And then that was because in the natural life of the raven, it's not a migratory bird, so it can't land on water. So it would have to come back to the boat, otherwise it would perish. Have you heard that before?
I haven't heard it, but it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that people would do that. I know, for example, in Australia, we have 5 species that would be called either ravens or crows. They all look very different. But occasionally a house crow from the Northern Hemisphere will turn up. It's happened in Western Australia. And what happens is that basically a cargo ship is leaving the Northern Hemisphere and this bird ends up, for whatever reason, on the ship, and then they get so far from land, the bird's like, where can I go? So it just hangs with the ship for months as it's traveling south, and then suddenly we get, another species of raven or crow turn up in Australia. Just the one bird, of course. But yeah, you're right. The crows and the ravens wouldn't migrate that sort of distance on their own.
So I guess in that situation, how would those birds then come to understand their new environment? If they got off the boat, say in Port Kembla, would they understand how to find food or shelter?
Yeah, birds generally do. It is an interesting thing. So this also happens with the migratory shorebirds. There are some that don't normally come to Australia, but then you'll get an individual that gets mixed up in this migrating flock of birds, and they end up going down the wrong side of the Pacific Ocean, for example. So you'll find species, yeah, like the bird watchers will be looking at hundreds or thousands of these shorebirds, along a lake or along the beach. And then they'll pick out, oh, that one's different. And it turns out it's something that took the wrong route and ended up here. And then you watch these birds, and it is kind of interesting to see how they interact with the rest of the flock. You hear the expression, birds of a feather flock together. I guess they're fairly liberal with that, because if you're also a shorebird and you're also small, then there's kind of safety in numbers. So most times they'll hang together, but sometimes the other birds are kind of like, who are you? And they'll pick on it and just sort of ostracize it to the edge of the group.
Oh, okay. That's not very good. Look,
So it does vary,
yeah.
but generally these vagrant birds, they do fine on their own. Yeah.
I'm so glad that I'm speaking to you today, because I have a bit of a quandary, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me figure it out. Over the past couple of days at my house, I've had some birds fly into my windows a lot, and I wonder what they're doing or why they're doing this behaviour. They sit on the windowsill outside my kitchen and they peck the glass. And they've come back like over the course of a few days. I go outside to see if they're hurt or if they need something, and they fly away. But then a moment later, they'll be back just pecking at the glass. Why would a bird try to come into the house?
Yeah, well, I don't think that it's so much coming into the house, but there's a lot of explanations. So if the bird is sitting there and pecking at the window, one explanation is that it's seeing its reflection and it's territorial.
Oh.
So it might be reading and thinking, oh, hang on a sec, what's that guy doing there? I'm going to peck at it. Another explanation is that sometimes birds will sit at the window and peck in order to get cobwebs. So when you've got spiders making cobwebs around the edges of your windows and eaves and so on, they'll pick up the cobwebs to line their nests as they're preparing to breed. But a third explanation, which is a little more tragic, is when birds actually fly into windows, they call that window strike, and it can kill the bird. Sometimes they get stunned and they land on the lawn, and then after a few minutes they kind of come to and fly off. Pretty much what goes on there is they see a reflection in the window of the sky. and they think it's clear space. So they might think it's an opening through which they can fly and they got clear sky ahead, but then they hit the window at full speed and it's not too healthy for them.
All right, I'll see if I can clear the cobwebs outside my windowsills, and that might make a bit of a difference.
Well, that's not too bad because they can use that. But for window stroke, a lot of people recommend putting up a tape or other measures to sort of put some distraction on the window and break up the view so that the bird can tell, oh, that's actually solid. That's not, a big clear opening I can fly through.
Right, okay, all right. Coming back to your experience watching migratory birds and native species of birds in the Shoalhaven, how healthy would you say are the numbers of shorebirds in the Shoalhaven?
To give the fair answer, I probably can't make a comment on how healthy it is. But what I can say is I've been watching birds all throughout New South Wales for a good 4 to 5 years now. And what struck me as really interesting as I go to a particular place several times over several years is that the bird life makeup varies drastically from year to year. A lot of birds will move around dependent on local environmental conditions. So when a particular eucalypt is in flower, all of a sudden you'll see huge numbers of a particular group of birds because they're there feeding. We had drought a few years back, so what you saw was a lot of birds along the coast that are normally inland birds. Things like freckled duck and other vagrant birds that just turn up because they're looking for somewhere where they can get, water and resources because the inland is so dry. And now more recently, over the last 12 to 24 months, we've had a lot of flooding in inland New South Wales. And with that, you get a lot of flooded fields, and that then as the waters recede, it produces these muddy habitats. So you get a lot of water birds inland. But if you went inland 2-3 years ago to these habitats, you wouldn't see those birds at all. So the population makeup is dynamic and it changes. And I think researchers who look into that sort of thing try and use that as a way to gauge how healthy is the environment more generally. But in a smaller scale, just around, as you mentioned, at Barara, so Conjola National Park kind of wraps around there, and most of that national park got wiped out by the fires recently. I was pretty surprised to see how quickly bird life reoccupied that space. It was quite burnt out. Some of the taller eucalypts survived, and within months you started seeing new growth come through. And I was actually quite astonished at how diverse the number of species were in that park over the following 12 months or 24 months that I was watching them.
What conditions need to change for birds to come back to the region after a fire passes through?
I think birds obviously need food. So if the plant life has been completely obliterated, which is what happened in sections of Moreton National Park, which I also took a look at maybe 6 to 12 months after the fires, it was really astounding. There was just nothing there. So if there are no food resources, the birds move on if they can. That's if they've survived the fires in the first place. But I guess not all species are adapted to be able to just move on. A lot of them are really sort of localized and they won't travel far. And then on the other hand, sometimes you get really surprised and things that you thought might not have survived will survive. But yeah, essentially you need food, you need water, you need shelter. So from predators, having sort of a dense understory of plant life, shrubs and so on, where smaller birds can hide and not be pursued by predators, that's important to them.
And
so yeah, that's mostly the land birds there that we're talking about with the fires.
You also run birding tours. When you kick a tour off and you bring a bunch of people down to a region to get out the old binoculars or telescopes, do you have a rough idea of what types of species you'll see and where you might find them when you take a tour out?
Yeah, so normally I'll ask how experienced is a person? Are they trying to chase down a particular type of bird or a specific species? Are they just happy to sort of look at the local area and have me talk about all the different kinds of bird life that's there? So bird life is correlated to habitat. So if we're going into the bush, there'll be certain kinds of birds that you can expect to see. If we're close to the beach or one of the lakes along the south coast, we can take some time and go and have a look at shorebirds, which is a different kind of birds. If you head up on the escarpments, sort of inland a little bit, again, you've got more heath habitat, and again, you get different kinds of birds. So you have specialist birds in the different habitats.
And as a part of your work, taking people on tours and generally photographing different birds, you've amassed quite a collection of pictures and data and information. Some of your photos show tags on the legs of birds. How do you contribute to citizen science in that aspect?
Yeah, the citizen science is a really good aspect. There's a lot of ways that anybody can contribute. So in the case of leg flags, a lot of these migratory birds end up with a leg band put on by researchers when they're just juvenile birds, so hatch from the eggs and before they can fly. And that leg flag will have a particular color, and it might have a letter or a number or a pair of letters, pair of numbers on it. And then as that bird travels throughout the world, when people see it, if they get a photograph or they get a good view of the bird through binoculars, they can note the number. There are different places where you can report these leg flags. And then that's how they get a bit of a picture on when and where these species migrate. But there's other options for citizen science as well. For example, one of the most popular birding websites is called eBird. It's published by a university in the States, but it does have hundreds of thousands of members around the world. So anytime you're watching birds and you make a note of which birds you've seen, you can submit that to eBird. And they literally have millions and millions and millions of observations from just about every country in the world. So a lot of scientists will then draw the data out of that website and use that in their research. And there are already thousands of research papers published using eBird data.
Wow.
All kinds of birds.
Yeah, okay. On the text line, Nellie from Minamurra has sent me a message. Nellie says, love the conversation on birds. When I think of the Illawarra and the Shoalhaven, it seems we have more spaces now for dogs, and this, I believe, has shifted the behaviour of birds. Please don't let the south coast go to the dogs. Do you find that dogs do sort of impact on the patterns of behaviour of birds and the environments that they can inhabit?
Yeah, dogs do. I guess I'll speak mostly towards the shorebirds. As I said, a lot of them are becoming very endangered, with even over 50% of their population disappearing in recent decades. They have very specific habitat requirements. So, the shore, the beach, or the shore of the large lakes like Lake Wallumbilla, it's limited habitat and they need it. And of course, it's popular for people and people with dogs as well. So what can happen is these birds will nest on the shore, or even if they're not nesting, like the migratory shorebirds from the Northern Hemisphere, they need to rest and they need to actually spend time feeding and building up bulk because they lose 50% of their body weight as they fly those distances. So even though they're not nesting here, they still need to be left alone so that they're not constantly, flying off. When a group of shorebirds is disturbed by a dog, say it runs and it's just chasing the birds and they fly off, typically they're going to fly for quite a long period of time before they manage to settle again. So they're actually burning up a lot of energy when really they need to be resting. And with the breeding birds, so for example, hooded plover is an Australian native, and it breeds from Barara Beach south through to Tasmania and around the southern shoreline of Australia. And there are other species like the oyster catchers, the black and white ones, and the black ones that you see. When dogs are present on the beach, the birds become sort of, they take evasive tactics to try and distract the dogs. So if the bird's sitting on the nest, that's like leading a predator to the nest. So the bird will run off and run away. And the dog owner might not know that. And even the dog might not even see the bird, or you might think it's not disturbing the bird. But that's taking the parent off the nest, off the egg, or off the young chicks. And the other implication that they've discovered is other predators will actually watch these interactions. So there are predatorial birds, for example, they'll notice this, and that's how they discover where these shorebirds are nesting, and then they'll come down and take the chicks or take the eggs.
Wow.
So it is, I completely understand. I mean, anyone who's lived in Australia for any amount of time along the coast loves the beach, and people love their dogs and they need space to run. But I think, taking a mindful approach to just how tough these birds are really doing it right now, and keeping dogs on leashes and not bringing them onto beaches where they're not supposed to be, where they've been restricted.
We're about to hit the news, Chris. We have 2 minutes. Just before you go, I'd love to hear, what is your favourite bird and why?
I've got a million favourite birds, but can I think of one off the top of my head?
Go for it.
Look, one of the common ones that most people will be familiar with is just simply the pied currawongs. I think currawongs are some of the most intelligent birds we have, and when you look at them, they kind of look at you in a way that says, "Hey, I'm thinking about you too. You're watching me, I'm watching you."
Great.
Yeah, they're a good bird.
Chris, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks so much for your time. And look, if you come across another rare bird in the future, I'd love to check back in with you and have another chat, if that's all right.
Excellent. There's plenty we can talk about there.
Great. All right, Chris, you have a good afternoon. Take care.